Chapter 251. Hector and Leslie's reinforcements weren't just muscle, they were Alnugo University's elite. Student council members, influential figures from well-off families, the president of the university's literary society, the head of the guitar club, even the vice president of the Taekwondo Association. The moment the crowd saw the lineup, whispers of shock rippled through them. Leslie had managed to rally half of Alnugo University's most prominent students to his side. The power dynamic shifted instantly. It was clear that Earl, Joshua, and their friends were in a dire situation. A tall, broad-shouldered athlete stepped up, glaring down at Hector and his crew. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. Who the hell thought it was a good idea to mess with Hector? Looks like we need to teach some nobodies a lesson. His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement from the rest of their side. They were ready to throw down. The ladies who had followed these big shots to the scene exchanged looks of disdain as they eyed Earl and his friends. Their expressions said it all. Earl's group was hopelessly outmatched. The difference was undeniable. It wasn't just about numbers. The background, connections, and sheer influence on their side made the gap even more obvious. Leslie and Hector, now brimming with confidence, started handing out cigarettes to their crew, casually leaning against the cars as if they were already celebrating their victory. After passing out the last cigarette, Hector smirked and crushed the empty pack under his foot. Then, turning to Earl, he shot him a look full of malice. Earl met it with nothing but indifference. The tension in the air was suffocating. A single move would set off the explosion. Then, to everyone's shock, Queenie suddenly ran forward. She dropped to her knees in front of Hector, her voice trembling. "Hector, please stop this. This won't end well for anyone." She didn't care about pride anymore. She just wanted to prevent the bloodshed before it was too late. But Leslie was having none of it. With a disgusted sneer, he kicked Queenie aside. "Get lost, you worthless whore," he spat. "Why the hell do you care if we beat your ex to a pulp? You should be happy to watch." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even those who had sided with Hector and Leslie found themselves momentarily stunned by the cruelty of his words. But no one dared to step in. Deep down, some people hoped Earl would somehow turn this around. They wanted to see someone finally put these arrogant bastards in their place. But realistically, the odds were stacked against him. At the back of the crowd, unnoticed by most, another group had arrived. Unlike Hector's crew's loud, showy presence, they sat quietly on the grass, watching the scene unfold. Among them was Leo, Earl's newly recruited disciple. Next to him sat familiar faces: Zane, the Gavinia siblings, Neil and Charlotte, all people Earl had known from his days in Perthter City. Zane and Charlotte were also students at Alnugo University, though they belonged to different faculties. Neil and Zane, on the other hand, studied at the nearby University of Political Science and Law. And Leo was enrolled at Chatside University next door. They had met up for a casual gathering, never expecting to stumble into such a massive brawl. And even more surprising, the main event featured none other than Earl. Leo made a move to step in, but Zane stopped him with a firm hand. Leo wanted to step forward and help, but Zane stopped him. Zane wanted to see how Earl would handle the crisis, and since Leslie was also an old acquaintance, it wasn't the right time to take sides. However, deep down, they were still leaning towards Earl. After all, they knew his strength. Their only concern was what kind of retaliation or underhanded tactics Hector might resort to if Earl won. In the crowd, Leslie subtly gestured toward his reinforcements. He didn't just want to win. He wanted Earl wiped out. He ordered them to fight with full force, and if things got out of hand, he and Hector would take responsibility for any consequences. On Earl's side, although they seemed slightly outmatched in terms of momentum, key players like Isaac, Joshua, and Samuel were fearless. They even exuded an attitude of determination, as if they were prepared to face death without hesitation. After finishing a cigarette, Earl casually flicked it into the nearby trash can and smiled disdainfully. Chapter 252. Did you get everyone you need? Earl asked. His mocking tone pushed Hector over the edge. Hector's face twisted with rage as he roared, you're asking for it." His crew, a pack of overconfident rich brats and jocks, sprang to their feet, cracking their knuckles and rolling their shoulders, getting ready to throw down. Leslie flicked his cigarette butt to the ground and crushed it under his shoe before pointing straight at Earl. "Get him, especially that loudmouth, beat him into the ground." Hector wasn't far behind, his voice ringing with fury. "Do you think we're pushovers? It's time to teach you a lesson you'll never forget." With those orders, the floodgates opened. Like a raging tide, Hector's and Leslie's men surged forward. The crowd erupted, some shrieking in terror, while others egged on the fight with gleeful cheers. Phones were whipped out, cameras were flashing, and videos were being live-streamed straight to the campus forums. Even the toughest guys on Earl's side, like Joshua and Isaac, felt a wave of unease. The sheer numbers against them were overwhelming. But Samuel was built differently. Wiping the blood off his face, he let out a roar and charged straight into the chaos. Earl was right behind him. A silver flicker cut through the air. Earl had tossed his lighter mid-run, and it smashed directly into the nose of a towering guy nearly 6'3". The impact sent a sickening crack through the air, and the guy let out a pained howl, crumpling to the ground with blood pouring down his face. "Get them. These bastards actually dared to fight back. Break them. Don't worry about the consequences, I'll handle it," Hector shouted, rallying his guys. The scene was pure anarchy. Samuel fought with wild desperation, throwing punches and dodging blows like a man possessed. Earl, however, was different. Every move was calculated, his punches landed with precise force, sending opponents sprawling. Those who tried to take him on one by one ended up flat on the pavement. Seeing this, the smarter ones began steering clear of him, leaving the weaker ones to be cannon fodder. But the rest of Earl's crew wasn't so lucky. Samuel, despite his tenacity, took several heavy hits. Joshua and Isaac held their own thanks to their height and build, but many of their classmates weren't fighters. Against trained athletes and street brawlers, they were clearly outmatched. Earl quickly assessed the situation, realizing they were at a disadvantage. He bellowed over the chaos, "Stick together, follow me. We move as one." Like a rallying banner, Earl became the focal point of their group, leading them in coordinated charges instead of scattered brawling. Under his command, the group from the finance faculty repositioned themselves, shielding their weaker classmates and launching targeted strikes. Their movements became precise, almost tactical. And just like that, the momentum shifted. Despite their superior numbers and physical strength, Hector and Leslie's crew had no strategy. They had assumed they could simply overwhelm Earl's side through brute force. But now, their formation was crumbling. Chapter 253. Under Earl's lead, the finance students found renewed courage. Their spirits soared, and they fought with a newfound intensity, scattering Leslie and Hector's crew in every direction. Earl wasn't about to let the masterminds off easy. He grabbed Leslie by the collar and unleashed a flurry of punches, each blow landing ruthlessly. Meanwhile, Samuel and Joshua had Hector pinned down, taking turns pummeling him without mercy. Even the supposed muscle, like the vice president of the Taekwondo club, Wayne Fuller, tried to rally the troops. Mimicking Earl, he attempted a dramatic charge. "Follow me. Use me as your flag. Charge." He barely got the words out before Isaac's fist connected squarely with his face. "Do you think you can compare to Earl?" Isaac scoffed. Wayne, for all his bravado, proved to be no match. Despite his tall and broad physique, one punch sent him crashing headfirst into a nearby trash can, legs dangling out in a comical display. Ironically, his butt stuck out prominently, a sight that would have been funny under different circumstances. Leo watched the chaos unfold, mouth agape. "Holy crap, Earl, you're incredible." Charlotte stood beside him, a slight smile playing on her lips as she watched Earl directing the fight with pinpoint accuracy. This was not the same guy she had met in a dingy internet cafe back in Perthter City. Yet, here he was, turning the tide in a seemingly impossible battle. Zane narrowed his eyes, re-evaluating Earl. At that moment, he saw not just a scrappy fighter, but a leader, someone who commanded respect and inspired others. The ladies from the shared dorm room were equally stunned. Watching Earl in action, they saw something almost luminous about him, as if he radiated an unexplainable energy. Queenie stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. The tables had turned so drastically. Earl and Joshua, once cornered, were now pushing back with overwhelming force. Meanwhile, Faye stood a few steps away, lips slightly parted, eyes fixed on Earl. Watching him fiercely protect his friends, she suddenly found clarity. Jerome's words echoed in her mind, and seeing Earl in action solidified everything. Suddenly, a voice from the crowd shouted a warning, "Run! They're calling in reinforcements." The warning came from one of the ladies from the School of Finance. They knew that while Earl and his friends had the upper hand, for now, the arrival of more of Leslie and Hector's allies would tip the scales. And right on cue, angry shouts erupted from the edge of the crowd. A group of thugs, armed with baseball bats and iron rods, stormed through, shoving aside onlookers with menacing glares. These guys weren't students, they were street toughs. Scarred faces and cold, dead eyes that spoke of countless street brawls. Leading them was a man in his 30s, gripping an iron rod with a wicked scar slashing from the corner of his mouth up to his eye. His presence was nothing short of terrifying. He bellowed, "Everybody, freeze!" The sheer force of his voice brought Earl and his group to a halt, their adrenaline momentarily stalling as they turned to face this new threat. Leslie and Hector, who had been cowering moments earlier, lit up with relief at the sight of their backup arriving. They scrambled over, desperation turning into vindication. Hector, gasping, rushed over to the scarred leader. "Robert, you finally made it. Teach these bastards a lesson, they dared to lay hands on us." Leslie, wiping the blood from his mouth, nodded coolly. "Take care of this, and I'll handle whatever comes next." These weren't just random thugs, they were friends from outside the university, the kind of guys Leslie and Hector relied on when things got rough. Hardened criminals who treated brawls and run-ins with the law like daily routines. For the university students, these men were the embodiment of fear itself. The finance students' bravado flickered. Their eyes widened and breaths hitched. They weren't prepared to face something like this. Chapter 254. Fighting Hector and Leslie's crew had been one thing. It was just a bare-knuckle brawl between students and nothing too serious. In the worst-case scenario, the school would hand down some minor punishments. After all, both sides had held back, knowing the consequences of going too far. But this was different. The thugs standing before them weren't students. They weren't bound by the university's rules, nor did they care about consequences. They didn't throw punches, they swung weapons like baseball bats and iron rods. Some of those bats even had dried blood on them, as if to remind everyone that these weren't empty threats. These guys weren't playing by the same rules. To them, breaking bones or even killing someone wasn't a big deal. If things got out of hand, they'd just go to prison for a while. So what? With the backing of powerful families like Leslie and Hector's, getting bailed out was just a matter of time. The students had hesitations. The thugs didn't. Fear spread among the finance students. Even the ones who had fought bravely moments ago now felt their hands go cold. But Earl remained unfazed. He stood motionless, rooted to the spot like a rock. His gaze was indifferent, almost bored, as if he wasn't the least bit concerned about the armed thugs in front of him. Robert, the leader of the gang, didn't even look at Earl at first. He acted as if the fight was already decided, like they were nothing more than prey trapped in his net. He strode over to Leslie, speaking with an air of finality. "Leslie, you're done here. Leave these losers to me." A lanky thug beside him chuckled, tapping his iron rod against his palm. "Boss is right. You don't gotta dirty your hands, Leslie. We'll take care of this. These college kids ain't got no spine. Won't be long before they're begging us for mercy." The other thugs cackled, their laughter dripping with arrogance. Leslie, however, wasn't as relaxed. He glanced at Earl and the others, then warned, "Don't underestimate them. They're tougher than they look." Robert sneered. "Do you think that matters? Let's see how tough they are against a metal bat." He swung his iron rod through the air with a sharp whistle to make his point, then grinned. "Do you want to hear a real story? Back in the day, I knocked up some chick from the Alnugo University of Technology. When she tried to make trouble, I made sure she solved the problem permanently. Guess what? No one dared to say a damn word. The entire crowd felt the sheer filth in his words. Even Leslie frowned slightly. He wasn't a good guy, but Robert's lack of boundaries made even him uncomfortable. But he didn't say anything. The finance students, however, were furious. They might have been scared, but this was their school. Their home turf. Getting humiliated like this in front of so many people, especially the ladies, was unacceptable. Robert took another step forward, pointing his blood-stained bat at Joshua. I'll give you one chance. Get on your knees and apologize. Joshua swallowed, instinctively stepping back. His voice wavered as he forced himself to stand his ground. Do you think we're scared of you? Robert let out a cold chuckle. Once I leave you crippled for life, we'll see how tough you still are. Isaac, Samuel, and the others braced themselves, knowing they were in deep trouble. But just as Robert was about to take another step, Earl finally spoke. His voice was calm and unhurried as he said, "Get the hell out of here in 10 seconds, or you'll regret it." Chapter 255. The crowd watching was stunned by Earl's fearless presence and sheer dominance. He had just taken on Leslie, Hector, and their crew, leaving them battered. Only someone this fierce would stand his ground against a bunch of ruthless thugs. Robert's face darkened. "Since you're so eager to die, I'll make it happen." He swung his baseball bat straight at Joshua, who had been standing in front. Joshua barely reacted in time. He tried to dodge, but the bat still caught his shoulder. Pain shot through him, turning his face pale. Robert's crew, cigarettes hanging from their lips, weapons in hand, saw their boss make a move. Without hesitation, they flicked their smokes away, gripping their bats and pipes, ready to follow suit. Robert had planned to take Joshua out first to shake Earl's confidence. Instead, he only fueled Earl's rage. Earl's voice thundered, cutting through the chaos. "If you've got guts, let's go." In an instant, under the stunned and breathless stares of Faye, Anna, Queenie, and the rest of their classmates, Earl charged straight at Robert. Behind him, Isaac let out a battle cry. "Let's go, guys." Even Leslie and Hector were left wide-eyed. They had expected Earl to be tough, but they never thought he'd go straight for a gang of armed thugs like it was nothing. Watching Earl fight like a force of nature, fists flying, fearless and unyielding, Leslie and Hector had a sinking realization. Had they made the worst mistake of their lives messing with this guy? Isaac, a towering 6'3" powerhouse from the Midwest, charged in like a freight train. Samuel, eyes burning with fury, clenched his fists. Tears and sweat mixed on his face as he roared, "Screw it. I'm taking you all down with me." It was a classic case of a desperate man having nothing to lose. Right now, for the sake of his friends, Samuel was willing to risk it all against these lowlifes. And when someone's willing to put their life on the line, that's when their enemies truly know fear. Joshua wasn't about to back down, either. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, he let out a guttural yell, grabbed a chair, and swung it at one of Robert's guys. But before it could land, a metal pipe cracked against his ribs, sending him crashing to the ground in a spray of blood. Earl saw it happen and snapped. His fist slammed into the guy's skull, dropping him instantly. Blood gushed from the thug's head as he hit the pavement. The others, seeing their buddy go down, rushed in for revenge. Earl grabbed a baseball bat off the ground and swung. The first one went flying, crashing onto the hood of a nearby car. The second and third weren't far behind, groaning in pain as they hit the ground. The rest of the gang hesitated. Across the lot, the guys in Earl's crew saw Joshua lying in a pool of blood. Their stomachs twisted. Isaac's eyes turned bloodshot. "Do you bastards think you can mess with one of us? I'll kill you." At first, some of the students had been hesitant. But the sight of blood, the rush of adrenaline, and the raw intensity of Earl's fight flipped a switch in them. More of them jumped into the fray, fists and makeshift weapons flying. Earl, covered in blood, fought his way through like a storm tearing through the battlefield. His sheer brutality only fired up the onlookers. These guys had been forced to bottle up their aggression, told by teachers and parents to stay in line and never to throw a punch. But that night was different. These thugs had walked onto their turf, running their mouths, calling them spineless losers. There was no way they were letting that slide. Chapter 256. Seeing Earl fight with fearless intensity, the sight of blood and chaos ignited something primal in the crowd. More students, guys from different majors, different grades, and different classes, felt the surge of adrenaline and jumped into the fight. Of course, not everyone had the nerve. Someone hesitated, whispering, "What if these guys pull out knives?" But a bolder student immediately shot back, "So what? If shit hits the fan, the tough ones will take the brunt." That was all it took. Fired up, they roared and charged at the gangsters, fists and makeshift weapons swinging. The number of students joining the brawl kept growing. It wasn't just Earl's classmates from the finance faculty anymore. The once spectating crowd turned into a tidal wave, overwhelming the gang. Even those who had been casually eating dinner or watching from dorm windows with binoculars threw down their food, ran outside, and dove in. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the pride of Alnugo University. They were making damn sure these thugs learned a lesson. No one came onto their campus thinking they could push people around. Life at college wasn't supposed to be just about exams and coursework. A little chaos, a little rebellion, it was moments like these that made memories. Years from now, when they looked back at their college days, they'd have stories worth telling. "I was there," they'd say. "I was part of the legendary battle where we ran a gang of armed thugs off the campus." With all the blood, fists, and chaos, it was straight out of an action movie. As the fight raged on, the energy only grew. The ladies watching from the sidelines had never seen anything like this. Some were crying, others were screaming, and a few scrambled to call the cops. But when they saw their classmates, normally bookish and quiet, suddenly turn into warriors, driving the gang back in a relentless fury, even they couldn't help but cheer. At the same time, the air filled with a chorus of shouts. "You motherfuckers picked the wrong school. You wanna start shit at Alnugo University. You're dead meat. Beat these bastards into the ground." Earl knew then, he didn't have to keep fighting. The fire had already spread. Alnugo University students had been pushed too far, and now there was no stopping them. The quiet, routine life of the campus had been shattered. After tonight, more students would stand up, fight back, and never let thugs walk in here again. The gang was finished. Faye, Anna, and the rest of the ladies stood frozen as more and more guys flooded out of dorms, wielding chairs, beer bottles, and anything they could get their hands on. They didn't hesitate. They didn't hold back. Like a wave, they crashed into the gang, drowning them in sheer numbers and brute force. From the dorm windows, dozens of heads peeked out, watching in stunned silence. The guys they had only ever seen buried in textbooks were now shouting, fighting, and throwing punches like their lives depended on it. It was surreal. At that moment, the students of Alnugo University weren't just students. They were heroes, and this night would become a legend. It would be retold, passed down, an unforgettable part of campus history. Even if the school tried to paint them as troublemakers, they would proudly wear that label. As for Robert and his crew, they were done for. There was nowhere for them to run. Students were attacking from every direction, with fists flying and weapons swinging. The gangsters, used to intimidating people with sheer bravado, felt their courage drain. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the hunted. They bolted, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. And Robert took the worst beating of them all. Faye was overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the fight, but through it all, her eyes never left Earl as worry gripped her chest. He had been at the front lines, throwing himself into the thick of it. The gang had come armed, and if he had made even one mistake, it could have led to a tragic outcome. Chapter 257. At first, the girls from the shared dorm room, including Anna and Queenie, had been praying that things wouldn't get too violent. They were especially worried about the finance students getting hurt. But when they saw the gangsters getting their asses handed to them, scrambling to escape, an unexpected thrill ran through them. These guys actually had guts. And suddenly, being paired with them for the shared dorm didn't seem so bad. It was almost a badge of honor. Leo, Zane, Neil, and Charlotte were just as stunned by the scene unfolding before them. They had known Earl could fight. But this. Leo clenched his fists, itching to jump in, but one look at Zane, who hadn't given the go-ahead, kept him in check. Charlotte's eyes flickered with intrigue. He's not just a good fighter. He knows how to lead. It wasn't just brute strength. Earl had been controlling the entire battlefield. Under his protection, his classmates weren't just fighting back, they weren't even getting hurt. It wasn't because the gangsters were holding back. It was because Earl was always in the right place at the right time, neutralizing the real threats before anyone could get seriously injured. This wasn't about his classmates being great fighters. It was about Earl making sure they had nothing to fear. Even Zane had to nod in approval. Yeah, he's the real deal. Watching it all unfold, Zane and Neil felt nothing but pure respect. Earl wasn't fighting 10 guys. He was taking on 100. Meanwhile, Hector and Leslie had gone pale. They had never imagined that hiring some outside muscle would backfire this badly. Coming from wealthy families, they had seen plenty in their lives, but nothing had prepared them for this, a full-scale student uprising. They had poked the beehive, and now the entire swarm was coming for them. Hector and Leslie were shaking as they scrambled toward their cars, trying to make a getaway. The girls who had been standing with them, usually full of smug confidence, were now frozen in fear, their faces drained of color. And those so-called tough guys, the jocks and artsy types who had been puffing their chests, smoking, and acting cocky just moments ago. They were gone, scattered like roaches the moment things got real. They're the ones who started this. Don't let them escape. Someone in the crowd spotted Hector and Leslie trying to slip away and shouted. The adrenaline-fueled students weren't about to let them get away. They grabbed rocks, bricks, anything they could find and started hurling them at the luxury cars. It didn't matter if they were worth tens of thousands or well over $100,000. Against flying bricks, they were all reduced to wreckage, glass shattering, metal denting, alarms blaring uselessly into the night. For years, Hector and Leslie had strutted around campus, untouchable, using their money and connections to call the shots. They had teamed up with outside thugs to rough up students more than once. People had always been too scared to fight back. But not tonight. Tonight, every grudge and every ounce of resentment came boiling to the surface. Hector and Leslie huddled in their car, trembling, frantically calling for help while praying they'd make it out unscathed. Finally, people from the security department arrived, followed closely by local law enforcement. The moment they showed up, the students scattered. The gangsters Robert had brought were sprawled out across the ground, moaning in pain, barely conscious. As expected, Earl, Isaac, Joshua, and the others who had fought at the front were rounded up for questioning. The injured gang members were hauled off to the hospital. Word spread fast, some of these guys had been beaten to a pulp. It wasn't surprising, they had been caught in a full-on ambush, trapped with nowhere to run. At the security office, the head of security, a heavy-set man, eyed the group before him. Who started this? Who was in charge? What the hell happened? Earl didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. He knew he had been the one leading the charge. He had fought the hardest, gone in the deepest. Escaping wasn't an option, but before the officers could press him, Joshua spoke up. He laid it all out, how his girlfriend had been harassed, how the gang had been called in to back up Leslie and Hector. Surprisingly, the security officers actually seemed to have some sense of justice. Chapter 258. The head of security was furious upon hearing about what had happened. He felt it was unforgivable that those hooligans had acted so out of line on Alnugo University's premises and that the students had done well in beating them up. He thought the students had been doing society a favor by teaching those hooligans a lesson and that the same should be done in the future. However, the auxiliary security members who came with him didn't agree. Daniel was one of them, and he thought the students had to be punished for their rash and violent actions. Otherwise, the ivory tower would become a haven for troublemakers and a breeding ground for malice. Joshua and the others countered that, saying they'd only fought back after being attacked. Moreover, the hooligans had been armed. They couldn't have stood by and waited for the hooligans to kill them, could they? Daniel frowned and indicated he would get to the bottom of the matter. However, he emphasized that they lived in a civilized society and that everyone needed to adhere to its laws. No one should use violence to solve any issues. Then, he insisted on taking Earl away. Only then did Earl remember who Daniel was. The latter was the one who'd pulled tricks to make things harder for him in the past when he'd also gotten caught for wrongdoings. Another security member named Ben Langley was nastier than Daniel. He berated the students for disregarding rules and being even worse than the hooligans. He wanted to capture Earl and the others and take them in for questioning. The students vehemently opposed him. Fortunately, the head of security said, "Those hooligans barged in here and tried to commit murder. They're just facing the consequences of their actions now. In fact, we have to hold them legally accountable once they've recovered from their injuries." He knew it wouldn't be overboard to sentence those thugs to jail, seeing as they'd trespassed on the university's premises to attack students while armed. The dean would be furious if things got out of hand, and the thugs wouldn't be the only ones punished. Everyone on the security team and the nearby police stations would be in trouble, too. The head of security had his own judgment and standards for deciding who to release and who to capture. Daniel knew this wasn't the right time to aggravate everyone, so he left without argument. Once he, Ben, and their colleagues were gone, the members of the security team reprimanded Earl and the others for their actions. They then took their statements and warned them not to act so impulsively in the future. Earl and the others were advised to exercise restraint and think about their futures before acting. After that, they were dismissed. When Earl and the others left the security department, they saw many of their classmates waiting outside for them. The young women from the shared dorm were there, as were Faye and Bianca. Miranda couldn't help teasing Earl when she saw him. "Look, our hero's here. Let's all welcome him." The others laughed and applauded Earl. He and the others had truly been braved earlier, especially Earl. He'd awakened the hot-bloodedness of the other young men by leading the charge against the thugs. Faye blinked and smiled. "The university administration didn't punish you guys, did they?" Earl shook his head. The head of security had reprimanded them sternly, but it was clear that he admired their bravery in going against the thugs. Bianca, who everyone thought was cold and stoic, was more concerned about their safety. "Are you guys hurt? Do you guys want to head to the hospital for a thorough check?" Someone teased, "How about you accompany our hero to the hospital?" A faint blush spread across her face at those words, but she soon composed herself. Earl indicated that he was fine, so Bianca turned to comfort the other students from the finance faculty. She showed that she was equally worried about the students as a student council member. Earl wasn't the only one she cared about. The other young men had never been on the receiving end of her gentle words, so they were extremely grateful to her. Chapter 259. It was getting late. The students talked for a while longer about the bravery Earl and the others had displayed when facing the thugs earlier before dispersing. Faye didn't think it was the right time to ask Earl about music, so she returned to the academy. She entered her dorm to find everyone excitedly discussing what had happened at Alnugo University. As well-behaved students from a prestigious academy, they'd always followed the rules, not daring to put a toe out of line. Naturally, an event of this magnitude left them stunned. They realized that even the most quiet and reserved young man could display such a strong sense of justice and courage when the time called for it. Faye was surprised how quickly the news of the fight had spread. Not only had it spread throughout Alnugo University, but it had also reached the ears of students in other prestigious academies in Alnugo. Photos and videos of the fight had already been shared on these academies' forums. The most striking figure was undoubtedly Earl, whose rallying cry had drawn a crowd of supporters. Even though his image in the video was rather blurry, his fearless stance as he led the charge against the thugs was unmistakable. The footage vividly captured his strong sense of responsibility in protecting his fellow students. The confrontation ultimately turned into a battle between the students and thugs. No one doubted it would leave its mark on Alnugo University's history. Lila, Sydney, and Marilyn squeezed before a laptop as they looked at the photos and videos on the forum. They occasionally let out exclamations of admiration. "Wait, why do I suddenly feel like this guy looks like Faye's high school friend? Earl Hernandez, was it?" Sydney sharply noticed the resemblance despite the blurry footage. Lila found the guy familiar, too. She turned to Faye and asked, "Is it him, Faye?" Faye hesitated before saying, "I don't know. I can't really tell." She knew it was definitely him, but for some reason, she chose to hide the truth. Could it be because she was afraid of Lila seeing how excellent Earl was? Faye sat by the window and stared at her reflection in the mirror, but her thoughts wandered. She'd humbled herself in the second half of her freshman year and had increased her interactions with Bianca. From then on, she'd managed to discreetly get updates on Earl without others noticing. Gradually, she found that she paid more attention to him than any other man. If she had to pinpoint the exact time this had started, it was probably when she'd learned he was sole. Faye had never been short of pursuers, but she'd started comparing them to Earl without even realizing it. None of them had gained her interest after she'd compared them to him. However, she was always deliberately cold and even haughty when facing Earl. She made herself seem like an unattainable swan when she was with him. Even she was confused by her conflicting behavior. Why did she have to be like that? She only decided to go to bed as it got later. She tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Lila and Sydney noticed this. Sydney teased, "Are you too excited to sleep because you're looking forward to the Crane guy's confession to you tomorrow?" Faye shook her head, wholly uninterested in the guy. Chapter 260. The following day was a Sunday, and the sun hung high in the sky. To Earl's surprise, he had a group of unexpected visitors: Zane, Charlotte, Neil, and Leo. They didn't have classes that morning, so they waited outside Earl's dorm bright and early. Charlotte called Earl and asked him to come downstairs to meet them. She had his number because he'd given it to her during the Internet Technology and Finance Summit. As for how they knew where he stayed, Earl and Leslie's conflict had spread all over Alnugo University. It wasn't hard to find out where the former was. Earl was surprised to see them. The fight had been so intense that he hadn't noticed them hidden in the crowd. Charlotte crossed her arms and smiled at the flash of surprise on his face. "What's there to be surprised about? Don't forget that we share the same alma mater." She winked mischievously at him. "I'm studying Cranish at the Foreign Language Faculty." Cranish was the third most used language in the world. Earl had tried his hand at learning it, but the results had been far from satisfactory. He didn't expect Charlotte to be a student of it. Zane held out a hand to shake his hand. "Hi." He was still as cold and stoic as before. Leo also held out a hand, but he was much more enthusiastic. "Hi, Earl. I study nearby, too. You left before we got the chance to speak last time. We wouldn't have had any way of reaching you if not for Charlotte having your number." Neil scratched his head. "Nice to see you again. It's one of life's greatest pleasures to meet a familiar face in an unfamiliar place. Look at us, meeting each other here." He was being a little dramatic. After all, this was only Earl's second time meeting Zane and Neil. However, this was an indirect way of showing that exceptional social skills could always warm one's heart. Earl had helped them once before, and his bravery in the incident with the thugs had won their respect. Leo's admiration for him was overflowing. He kept talking to Earl, his tone warm and friendly. The group headed to an outdoor eatery. The food there was nice, and the place was a down-to-earth establishment that wouldn't make Earl feel out of place. Leo sat down and propped his feet on a stool before calling, "Get us some kebabs, mister." He was evidently familiar with the area around the university. The owner greeted him warmly and asked whether they wanted any alcohol. Did they want beer or something stronger? Charlotte said, "Give us something stronger." She was as bold and carefree as she'd been at the internet cafe in Perth City. Everyone struck up a conversation with Earl as the owner bustled around in the kitchen. Aside from talking about Skybound Wars, they also talked about interesting things that had happened on campus. The focus was still on the earlier brawl and how the university had dealt with it, though. Earl noticed that Charlotte and Neil were both good conversationalists, especially Neil. Despite his appearance, he was great at socializing and could swiftly win people over with his words. Leo turned to Earl excitedly. "Can you teach me how to fight, Earl? I seriously admire you." Earl smiled. "I can teach you if you want to learn, but be prepared for a tough journey." Leo became agitated at that. I'll treat you as my mentor from now on. He came from a family of soldiers and had been interested in martial arts since childhood. He was especially fascinated by fighting techniques, so he was overjoyed that he had the chance to pick up a thing or two from Earl.